Welcome once again to this rather unusual festival of fright. I've taken the liberty of dimming the lights and turning up the air conditioning to put a bit of a chill in the air in order to create the appropriate atmosphere. I'm about to take you on a journey some 2,000 years into the past. At first, the backdrop, and indeed the story itself, might seem familiar to you. This is Palestine in the 1st century, a time and place in which some rather extraordinary events unfolded, but not quite in the way you've been told. I offer you now Son of the Father, a horrifying odyssey duly registered here on the Nightfall radio show. The crowds feared him, but they knew that the Romans did as well, and so this was sufficient cause for them to clamor for his release. Like the other prisoner, he had been seen to work feats of magic, summoning storm clouds, conjuring spirits, raising the dead. No one knew from whence he came, and he seemed to move only in the shadowy folds of the night. Caiaphas had cajoled Pilate that it would serve the greater good. It would quiet the streets, and certainly this would please Tiberius. Then there was the added benefit of enraging Herod. Initially they didn't know his name, for he had referred to himself only as the Son of the Father. In a mocking gesture, Pilate had inquired how that was said in Aramaic. His aide did the translation. Barabbas. As his shackles were loosened, the torches illuminating the hall captured his eyes, which seemed to explode in a blaze of power. He chanced to look over at the other prisoner. He thought it strange that this man, this fool from Nazareth, though condemned to Golgotha, looked upon him with pity. But now he was free, and his thirst demanded attention. The attending centurion unbolted the door, and the man exited the hall. Once he entered the darkened corridor, he dashed with preternatural speed through the courtyard and out into the windless black air. And it was thusly so. The Nazarene began his torturous journey to be crucified. And in the silent, cold hours just before dawn, a vampire stalked the alleyways and rooftops of Jerusalem. And that concludes another excursion into the darkness on the Nightfall radio show. Thank you for listening to the program. The Nightfall radio show can be heard exclusively on the Blackwater Media YouTube channel. If you enjoy the show, please remember to like, subscribe, and share. If you would like to submit a short story, poem, or artwork, email your submission along with a brief bio to nightfallradioshow@mail.com. I'm your host, Dr. William Lester. I'll see you again at Nightfall.
Arthur, how would you pronounce L-O-N-G?
Why, long, of course.
That's right. Now, how do you pronounce L-O-N-G-E-R?
Longer. Say, what is this, 5th grade recitation?
No, it's just my way of reminding you that king-size wing cigarettes are 20% longer, which means wings are cooler and smoother. Get a pack of longer, cooler, smoother king-size wing cigarettes.
Thank you for joining me this evening. I noticed that most of you have arrived armed with certain protective paraphernalia: crucifixes, sea salt, wolfsbane, and holy water. I doubt, however, if tonight they'll do you much good. You see, tonight I offer up a selection that deals with matters of the flesh and what terrors might be unleashed in the excessive pursuit of creature comforts. Our story is called The Kiss, and is presented to you here on the Nightfall radio show. What lies behind us and what lies before us are small matters compared to what lies within us. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Boston, Massachusetts, 1845. Elizabeth Florence unzipped her bag, tugging hard when it got to that spot where it always hung up. Ah! A broken tooth on the zipper. A second tug at it passed and the back opened up. She reached in and took out the 4 candles and looked around the room. There, on the dresser, was the perfect place for the large one. The mirror on the wall would provide excellent reflections. Carefully, she selected a resting place and set the candles around the room. On a bedside table beside the table lantern, on a table across the room, and one on the windowsill. She lit each one as she carefully placed them, looking at him on the bed, resting so peacefully, to see if the light was hitting him just right. She walked to the bedside table and turned the wick down on the lantern, extinguishing the flame so the only light in the room was the low glowing illumination of the candles. She walked back over to her bag and turned to face him. He was such a powerful looking man. She remembered vaguely the first time she had seen him with his wife at the park. She was shooting some photos for a newly married couple and saw him in the distance. At the time, she didn't think twice about him, other than he was strikingly handsome. But she had no interest in him at that time, for obvious reasons. There was a certain type of man to which she was drawn. She had no idea that they would end up like this. She smiled. She pulled the makeup kit out and took it to the bedside table, setting it down beside the candle. She walked back to her bag and reached in, withdrawing a small piece of silk paper that had the red waxy paint on it. She rubbed it against her lips, painting them the ruby red that matched those maidens of the night she saw on the north side of town at dawn. She placed the toe of her left rose shoe on the heel of her right and lifted her let to slip it off. She then took the toes of her right foot and placed them on the heel left and pushed that shoe off as well. Standing barefoot on the cold wooden floor, she began unfastening the buttons on her dress, pulling it over her shoulders and letting it fall to the floor. She reached behind her and pulled at the strong, loosening the corset that squeezed her into her hourglass shape. She was a beautiful woman and her hips were curvy, but the corset was a must for the woman in today's society. As the corset popped loose, she slid it over the curves of her hips and thighs and let it fall to the floor, stepping out of it. Her white linen chemise was draped below her shoulders, revealing the soft, milky skin, and she smiled at him, knowing she would shudder at his touch. She reached between her breasts and pulled the string to loosen the bow and allowed the soft cotton garment to fall to a heap at her feet. She stepped out of it and began walking to the bed, smiling at him. She touched his bare foot, feeling how frigid he was in this cool room, and began walking her fingers up his legs, over the leg of his pajamas, and placed her hand flat, sliding it up, feeling the muscles beneath. Her hand continued to slide to his chest, and she marveled at the shape of his body. She crawled into the bed and laid beside him, holding her finger to her lips to say, "Shh." She knew his wife was near, and it would not be wise to draw attention to the room. She began unbuttoning his nightshirt from the top, 1 button, 2 buttons, and slid her hand inside to touch his chest, her fingers gliding through the hair. He pulled back and unbuttoned the 3 final buttons and tossed the shirt open, exposing his chest. Her heart began to race, seeing his naked torso, and she knew he must feel it. She threw a leg over his waist and was atop him, straddling him, as she placed both hands on his stomach. She took a deep breath and again placed her finger against her bright red lips. "Shh, darling, not a peep," she whispered. She reached down and untied the string holding his night pants on and began loosening the waist and pulling them down, sliding down his legs and pulling the pants with her until she had them completely over his feet. She smiled in marvel at his body and could feel herself pulsating with desire. She placed her hands on his feet and began sliding her hands up his legs as she began to crawl back up. She got her hips positioned over his, her legs straddling his body, and she stared at him, feeling his love for her and hoping he would feel hers for him. It was the aroma. There were many things that attracted women to men. Yes, the thought of today's society was that real ladies didn't think like that. She thought. She would be ostracized by the community had they known the thoughts that ran through her fair head. For her, it was the aroma. The smell that came through her nose and penetrated her soul was erotic. It awoke the carnal beast in her every time. His skin was velvety smooth and the hair on his chest was sexy. She slid her hands up his chest and leaned down, pressing her lips against his cheeks, her hair spilling over his face, and kissed to his lips, where she pressed hard against him and slid her tongue into his mouth. She kissed him hard and could feel his hand against her leg below. She could feel his manhood against her below, and she began moving her hips, rubbing against him. She kissed him and then pulled away from him, kissing down his neck. She allowed her lips to trace his neckline and down his chest as she began to crawl backwards down his body. She leaned back up. The heat on the inside of her thighs was intense as they rubbed against his hips. She reached down between her legs, finding him and rubbing him in her hand. She looked down at him and smiled, leaning her head to the side and playfully staring at him through the curtain of hair draped across her face. She rubbed herself against him and slid her legs apart, lowering herself onto him. A gasp, a light moan escaped her as she felt him inside. She took his hand from her leg and lifted it to her face, taking a finger into her mouth. She smiled as she slid it from her lips and slowly lowered it to her breasts, pressing it hard against her. She arched her back and held her head back and rode him, watching the shadows from the candlelight dance across the walls and ceiling of the small, dark room. She turned her head, looking over her shoulder at her reflection in the mirror of her riding her man, and ripples of bliss flowed through her body as she flooded him beneath. She leaned forward and laid her breast against his chest and her head on his shoulder. She whispered, "I love you," as she kissed his cheek and just laid there for a few moments together, resting in peace. She looked in the mirror, straightening the bodice of her dress. She looked at the low neckline and made sure that it was low enough to showcase the locket that hung from her necklace. She placed the candles back into her bag. She then placed the makeup cases back into her bag, zipping the bag closed and, again, fighting with the zipper as she tugged it past the broken tooth. She turned and looked at him and smiled. He was so handsome in his suit. She walked to the bed and leaned down, whispering, "I'll see you in a few minutes, sweetheart." She kissed him on the lips again and turned to get her bag. As her hand turned the doorknob of the door, she took one more glance at her prince, smiling at him, and opened the door and whisked out of the room. The others in the room looked up as she entered, closing the door behind her. She felt that level of excited nervousness that she always felt. Did they hear anything? Were they listening? She surveyed their eyes. Did they know? The woman in the purple dress, his wife, walked towards her. Her eyes were wet and slightly bloodshot. She stared into Elizabeth's eyes, and Elizabeth noticed she was wringing her hands together. "Is he..." She struggled with her words and looked down at her hands as if the words were there. "Is he ready?" She looked back to Elizabeth and saw that there were tears in her eyes as well. Elizabeth touched her hands and nodded from behind her tears. She could feel the woman's hands trembling from the tremendous grief and absorbed it, allowing it to well up in her own emotions. Yes, she sobbed lightly. Yes, he is ready. She turned to the two men, one his brother, and the other the brother of his wife. You can bring him in and set him up now, she said. Please take care with his face, as the makeup is already on him. Elizabeth walked to the parlor where her calotype was and began preparing the paper with the chemicals for the photography. She was almost finished when the two men carried him into the room and placed him in the high-winged back chair. They positioned his arm on the arm of the chair, and she looked at his positioning. They took his other hand and put its fingers inside his vest, allowing the vest to support the dead weight of his arm. She nodded, and they walked back into the other room. She went behind them and pulled the doors almost shut, leaning out towards the family. We will be about an hour here, she nodded. It takes a long exposure to get an acceptable image, and we want to make sure we get a very good image to keep Mr. Albright's memory with us always. She smiled and closed the doors behind her. She smiled at him. At last, alone again. Their final hour together. Good evening once again. It has been said of old that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And perhaps such sayings remain with us down through the ages because they are in essence quite true. Exhibit A, the ruler of an ancient kingdom, is the subject of our story, and he is driven by exploding visions of power and conquest. But what happens when such visions take the form of flesh and blood and seek to exact their own form of justice? That question is answered in our tale, which is entitled Of Malice and Kings, a story filed in the permanent archives of the Nightfall radio show. For want of a kingdom, a curse was cast. For want of vengeance, the dead must walk. The king was dead, quite dead. In life he had been called the Great One, and indeed the name of the king, which was Jatif, could be translated to mean something approximating jaguar lurking. His rule was such, and so was his eventual demise. Some would later say that the little dark man known as Albir was responsible for the entire affair. In part, I am inclined to agree, but that is neither here nor there, as we must not permit hearsay to compromise the truth. You see, Albir had in fact been royal vizier, and was learned in the ways of magic and all manner of mystic arts. For this reason he was held in especially high regard by the king, who in truth knew little of such matters. Now it often occurred that King Jatif would wish to consult the spirits on matters of state and on personal affairs as well, as he was known from time to display more than a portion of ineptitude in both areas. Now for this consultation Albir served as medium. The spirits spoke through him, you see, and he delivered the messages directly to the king. Now one night King Jatif decided to consult the spirits about a situation that was making him more than a little nervous. His advisors, many of whom held ill favor with him, had told him of a kingdom which lay to the west and was seeking to expand its borders. This kingdom, he was told, had even sent out raiding parties, which were known to have marauded caravans and villages all up and down the great river. Though he knew that the treachery of some of his court knew no bounds, their words in his eyes constituted a terrible threat to his kingdom. He therefore sought the advice of the spirit world about what he should do. For want of fear, a war was waged. Now it came to pass that the armies of King Jatif swept across the western countries, destroying all who stood in their path. Blood flowed like the great river, and thousands were killed. A useless tidal wave of death inspired by a paranoid despot. The armies eventually returned, bringing gold, priceless jewels, slaves, and many other spoils of conquest. Jatif was at last satisfied, as much as one such as he could be at any given time. He assumed his kingdom was safe and believed that the newly acquired wealth would ensure prosperity for the kingdom, specifically himself, for a long, long time. One day Albir was coming out of the royal court, which had been in session all morning, when he chanced to hear some muffled references to a plot to murder the king. At this he was greatly troubled, though not entirely surprised, for he knew that there were many people who had opposed, albeit privately, the harsh and unwarranted exclusionary proclamation. He too had warned the king about the degree to which his actions had been applied, that the spirits held disdain for men of such vile ambition, that they may even in fact seek to punish him. For want of restitution, the ground opens. That night, Jatif was meditating in his private chamber when a knock came on the outer door. He ignored it at first, but thought better of it, and called for a guard. Time froze. Then the silence of the night was shattered by a single ghastly scream. When the great door swung open, the king saw them. Slaughtered in countless ways, some without heads or arms, some with eyes and great flanks of flesh gouged away. He saw blood running in one endless, horrific, great river. A legion of the dead. Soldiers, warriors, herdsmen, housemaids from across the Neftu, the desert from above the delta, in Unati. Vengeful dead, come to claim justice for their butchered bodies and tortured souls. Come to add one more to their ranks.
When you're looking for a treat to freshen taste and keep breath sweet, get double smoothness, flavor too. Get the gum that's double good to chew.
Double your pleasure, double your fun with double mint gum.
You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. I welcome you once again to this Netherworld arcade. If you find the chill in the air somewhat disconcerting, you know that you've come to the right place. You see, the air is stirred from the phantoms and specters flitting about just overhead. But don't mind them, they're just looking for attention. Tonight's tale concerns maternal instincts and how that ancient, nurturing drive can, on occasion, open a door to a primordial evil that cannot be closed. Our story is entitled The Thing in the Woods, and such a set of circumstances are only possible on the Nightfall radio show. It was told to me by some old acquaintance familiar with the folklore of Georgia that some 200 years ago, deep in the backwoods, there lived a woman named Catherine. Now, history has lost her family name, though some said it was Ellison or Wellingham or something like that. She did have a husband named Thomas. He was known to be of a quiet and solitary nature, though no one thought this strange given that they were simple folk, wood folk, accustomed to the quiet stillness of the deep woods. Now, after being married for just a short while, Catherine felt as if she wanted a child, and she felt as if she wanted one more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. Often, Thomas would say, "I wish I had me a son. That boy would be the best hunter in Georgia, and hell, maybe these whole United States." Sometimes, when Catherine was busy with housework, she would pause momentarily and gaze out the kitchen window, imagining a child, hers and Thomas, playing outside. Now it happened that Catherine began spending most of her days at the local church, praying for a child. "Please let me have a baby," she would beg. "I promise I would love that child so. I would do anything, give anything for a child." But her prayer was never realized. Now, most people in those parts knew that there was a stretch of woods that was haunted. Not haunted, mind you, by the ghosts of some violated Indians or brutalized slaves, but rather haunted by evil, inhuman spirits. These were diabolical entities that had never walked the earth in the form of flesh and bone. Although the area was generally avoided when people had to travel the area, they kept to the path, an old but well-worn trail, for they risked their lives and even more should they have ventured beyond the safety of the path. Years before, when Catherine was a girl, her mother had often warned her about lingering in the woods, coming and going before and after school. "You be careful, Catherine. Keep your feet on the trail. Don't be wandering off chasing behind no butterfly or rabbit or nothing. You walk straight down that path and don't pay no mind to nothing else." Now, as spring brought with it a blossoming countryside, Catherine left home one sunny morning in April to go to church. Now, it so happened that the path that she was accustomed to taking was the same one that she had taken as a girl, going to and from school. The same road that ran through the stretch of demon-haunted wood. As she looked all about, she chanced to see the prettiest flower that she'd ever seen growing right alongside the path. It had long white petals and a beautiful ruby red center. Then she noticed something else. Beyond the lovely flower grew another, and another, and still another. "I'll take these to church and give them to the sweet Virgin Mary," she said. "Maybe then she'll hear my prayers." Excited, she began picking the lovely flowers. As she picked one flower after another, she moved, quite unaware, deeper and deeper into the woods. Her attention was aroused by the sound of a child crying, yet the sound seemed somehow distant and muffled. As she looked off into the distance, she caught a glimpse of a small object bundled in blue under a tree. As she moved closer, she recognized the object as a blanket that contained within it a baby boy. "How is it that your mother would be so careless as to leave you alone out here?" she asked the child, and her excitement grew. "Maybe the Virgin has answered my prayers by sending me to find the child. I'll take him home. He will make a fine son for Thomas." Carefully holding the baby, Catherine hurried out of the woods. As she feared the road, however, it occurred to her that she had not thanked the angels and the Blessed Virgin for giving her a son. She took her shawl from around her shoulders and spread it gently beneath the tree, knelt and began to pray. To her surprise, however, as her words of thanks left her lips, the child began to shriek and yell horribly. She kept on praying, and the child screamed louder with ripping wails of torment, as though the prayers themselves brought him great agony. And so Catherine decided that she would continue her prayers at home after the baby had been fed and put to bed. Reaching for the blanket to pick up the baby, she pulled back one corner of the blanket and was instantly doused in waves of complete and utter horror. What once had been a beautiful baby boy beneath the soft folds of the blanket was now a squirming, horrid, wriggling creature, more insect than human, with 3 gigantic black spheres which she knew to be the thing's eyes, twirling madly in their sockets. And as she watched it, it began growing. It pulsated and writhed in a sickening pool of bubbling white foam. Now it is said by a great many of the old folk that when somebody is confronted by pure evil, that the person either freezes up or is moved to action. Thankfully, Catherine was disposed to the latter. She quickly backed away from the entity, closed her eyes, and visualized herself bathed in the beautiful white light. This, she believed, was the power of Christ, the power that would keep all evil things at bay, the power which moved the stars, brought the rain, and brought the rising and setting of each day's sun. She believed all of these things, and thus we see the great irony inherent in many of man's beliefs. We see it and we understand, for as the creature took hold of Catherine's mind, paralyzing her, it engulfed her entire being, her mind, the gray matter of her brain, her flesh and blood, her bones, hair, arteries, and organs. It fed upon her totally, satisfying its hellish urges. And as that ethereal part of her, some say spirit, some call it soul, slipped away into a new reality, it too was devoured by the beast. She ceased to exist at all levels of creation or dimension, thus fulfilling the entity's one true wish, the advent of true death.
Hey everybody, this is Dr. William Lester. Thanks for listening to the Nightfall radio show Anthology 2. To hear more anthologies like this and other shows, visit the Blackwater Media Facebook page. Also coming soon for 2019, a new Darkfall radio story entitled The Wendigo. Now back to the show.
Hello and welcome. It is indeed a pleasure to see you all once again. Your presence here is indeed a credit to your courage and constitution. Down through the ages, sages and scholars of many sorts have advised vigorously against dabbling with and the conjuring of spirits. You see, you can never really be sure about exactly what it is you're communicating with, and in such a set of circumstances, it's almost never good. Our tale tonight is one such example of a vile entity, gone renegade in our world, and you may rest assured that its sole objective is your destruction. The title of our story is The White Demon, and fortunately for you, I've managed to contain it here on the Nightfall radio show. We all have darkness inside of us, the depth of which is determined by the measure of those things from which it was created. The darkness inside of my family is an abyss, and the screams that come from the other side of that darkness is an endless haunting inside my head. Everything I am about to tell you is true. It began with a dream, though a more appropriate description would be nightmare. I woke abruptly to the screams of children. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I could feel my heart racing, feeling as if it would beat out of my chest. As I looked around the room, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, I could see my sister, Missy, 5 years my senior, in the other bed fast asleep. Why didn't the screams wake her, I wondered. Missy, in a loud whisper across the room. Missy, wake up. The words sounded muffled in my head like I was talking into a can. During my futile attempts to wake her, I caught a glimpse in my peripheral vision of a shadow moving past the doorway and down the hall on the second floor. Slowly, as if I were navigating an imaginary minefield, I crept to the doorway, As my bare feet left the soft rug and found the hardwood floor in the hallway, I saw the shadow leave the landing of the staircase and go down the stairs. I crept down the first 6 steps of the landing, peeking around the banister down the next flight of stairs. At the bottom, I saw the shadow and realized it was not a shadow at all, but more of a black mist. It had no shape, no features, but I knew it was staring at me. It moved without touching the floor, down around the corner of the stairs, and I followed. As I reached the first floor, I was very cautious and quick to move away from the living room, which was to the right of the staircase, and into the den to the left. Pahu was in the living room resting on the piano. No one in our family, at least the kids, wanted anything to do with being in the same room with Pahu. His is a story for another time. As I rumbled into the den, I saw the thing on the other side of the glass pane swinging door that led into the dining room and kitchen, but the door had not moved. It was as if the black thing had gone through it. As I went into the dining room and to the left into the kitchen, I knew immediately where this thing was leading me, to the pantry, where there was a door to the basement. The wood door was very old and heavy with a skeleton key lock, always very cold to touch. I first found that out playing hide and seek with my cousins. Finding a great spot beneath the bottom counter of preserves my grandmother jarred by herself, I would lean my back against the door and notice how cold it felt against my shoulder, almost as if there was ice on the other side of it. Once, when Tommy, one of my cousins, found me and we let out a loud bit of laughter, my grandfather stormed into the pantry. "What are you kids doing?" he shouted in his deep voice and his arms cocked by his side like he was ready to fight. "Nothing, Grandpa. We're just playing hide and seek," Tommy said. "Did you try to open that door?" He peered into our eyes, assessing us for lying. "No, sir," I said. "It's locked." "Yes, it is locked," he said firmly. "And you kids are never to try to open that door. Do you understand me?" Nodding, Tommy asked, "Grandpa, what's down there?" He turned back, and if looks were lasers, there would have been a hole in Tommy's head. "Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," was said back in chorus. He left us standing in the pantry with even more curiosity than before. As I entered the pantry, I could see that the door was open and the screaming was getting louder. It sounded like the screams of several kids who couldn't have been much older than me by the pitch of their sounds. I looked into the basement, down the stairs, and though it was black, there was a faint lightness below. I began down the steps, and the room was cold. With each step down, it got colder, and the screams became louder. When I reached the bottom of the staircase, I could make out nothing in the thick blackness. Out of nowhere, the face of a girl lunged at me. Not much older than me at 10, her eyes were wide, tears welling up around them. A look of panic on her face. Hair disheveled, her skin had a pallor about it that I had only seen at my great-grandmother's open casket funeral, when for the first time I had gazed upon a corpse. I felt her frigid hands touching, grasping for me, fingernails clawing at my cheek. It began to sting instantly. Jumping backward, I felt the hands of others reaching out of the darkness, pulling on my pajama shirt on one side, the other on my arm. These hands were cold and pale. The nails and fingertips were very dirty, as if they had been clawing at the earth. Perhaps it could have been dried blood. Too difficult to tell in the dark. Then I felt another set of hands tugging at my pants leg, icy fingertips sliding down the cloth to the top of my bare feet. I could feel cool, damp concrete, the floor beneath me. "Please," she pleaded. "Please make them stop. Please help us." She vanished as abruptly as she'd appeared, as if something snatched her back into the blackness. Desperate shrieking screams mixed with cries for help. Yet while I could not see anything, I knew they were all girls. I couldn't tell how many, but knew there were more than 2 or 3 by the number of different pleas uttered simultaneously. I knew at the very least 4 sets of hands had touched me. As I began to back up, I leaned over, stretching out my neck, as if that would help my vision cut through the darkness, and that was when I saw his face. Smooth as glass, white as snow.
black circles around his eyes. I realized as I surveyed his face it was because they were sunken deep into the recesses of his head. His nose was long and had the slight pointedness to it. His eyes, a slight tint of yellow, where white should have been, no color to the iris. It was completely black as the coal that Grandpa put in the stove in the mornings to take the chill off the den. His lips were nearly colorless, cracked and dry. Leaning over me, his sinister-looking grin revealed abnormally large teeth, appearing very sharp, like gazing at a yellow saw blade inside his foul mouth. I realized I was no longer in the cellar. Back in my bed on the second floor, this ghastly creature in my face leaned closer. The stench I could smell on his breath stunk of rotten meat. What I had thought was smooth skin was actually covered with tiny scales. Raising a finger to his lips, it was long, crooked, slender, and also covered in scales. Puckering his parched lips, sound that emerged from them was deafening. Shh! It whistled through my mind. I knew a hideous creature was not telling me to hush as I remained silent in its presence. Instead, it was warning me to keep my mouth shut about what I had seen. It was a threat. Suddenly, the screaming in my head stopped abruptly and I sprang up in bed. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. I could see Missy still sleeping in her bed across the room. Daring to move, I went into the hallway, but only dim light from the bathroom illuminated the night. Listening, peering through shadows, awaiting the sounds of children I had seen in the cellar, I heard nothing. Back in my bed again, the light came on. Missy was standing beside me, leaning down over me, both hands on the bed. My sister was staring at me. "What are you doing, Jimmy?" "Nothing," I said. I guess I just had a bad dream." "Well, stop screaming before you wake everyone," she said. She leaned her head forward and squinted her eyes. "What happened to your face?" "What?" I asked as my hands went to my cheeks. "Your face. You've got scratches." She reached out to trace the marks on my face, lightly touching the skin, then looked at me accusingly. 3 claw marks on my face stung as the tips of my fingers found them. I must have scratched myself." "Go back to sleep," Missy said as she went back to her bed, leaned over and turned the lamp off. "Missy," I said, "can we leave the light on?" "Oh my God," mumbling beneath her breath, she tugged on the chain of the lamp, dimly illuminating the bedroom. Before turning back, she said to me, "Don't worry, he won't be back tonight." He? I thought to myself. He who? What the hell was she talking about? Had she seen the monster in the room? Was it real? My fingertips once again found the scratches on my face. They still stung to the touch. "Missy," I whispered, no answer. "Missy," I loudly breathed, but she was already fast asleep. I did not return to slumber that night. Instead, I propped my head up on the pillow so I could see the entire room and pulled the blanket all the way up to my chin, as if to provide security from anything that would try to threaten me. Sleep eventually reclaimed me. It finally pulled me back, but it was not deep or peaceful. When I awoke the next morning, Missy was sitting on the side of her bed, brushing her long, dark hair, as she did every morning. I was relieved. Everything looked normal around the room. A dream. I nervously laughed at myself. It was only a terrible dream. As I looked back to Missy, she put the brush down on the bedside table. Slowly walking towards me, her eyes squinted as if straining to see something. "They're gone," she said. "What? What's gone?" I knew what she was talking about. "The marks," she said. "You were bleeding from scratches last night. The 3 marks on your cheek. They're gone." My hand went to my face. First one side, then the other. No stinging, no scratches. They were gone. "You saw him, didn't you?" Missy leaned toward me, spoke softly in a lighter voice as if others were listening outside of the room. "What?"
My brow frowned. I was confused. How could she have known? What? Who? I felt dizzy. The room felt like the tilt-a-whirl at the state fair, and nausea was beginning to overcome me. I don't know. The white monster? Whatever he is, but he's not a man. But he's taken others there. Missy knew. My mouth opened, but I couldn't find any words to speak. Me, Jane, Brett, Terry, and I'm pretty sure Tommy, but he won't talk about it. We've all seen him, and we've all heard the girls screaming. They were cold, I blurted out. They were cold and pale, like Granny was at her funeral, and their hands were like ice, and they kept grabbing and tugging on me. What? You saw them? I don't think any of us have ever seen them, just heard them screaming. It was surreal what I was hearing from my sister, what I was recalling. There was no way that it could be real, but I knew that my dream was no dream at all. The white monster haunted us for years to come, and it was only later in life that we discovered who he was, what he was doing in the cellar, who the girls were, and what was causing their frightening screams. However, that is a story my family does not wish to tell. Unfortunately, I cannot claim that this was the last time any of us saw this demon in our sleep. I'm honored once again to have you all as my guests. You are most welcome to join me in this exclusive presentation of Malice and Terror. This time our tale is a rather simple one. It speaks to the pitfalls of ignorance, especially when it comes to the unfortunate effects of the full moon. Our story is aptly entitled, Whose Name But the Wolf's? And it comes to you, silver bullets and all, courtesy of the Nightfall radio show. There are, I insist, such things as werewolves. Trust me, I'm an expert in matters like this. I've done a lot, and I mean a lot of damn reading on the subject. You see, the thing is, we've all been kind of conditioned. Well, to tell you the truth, fucking programmed is more like it. To accept some things as real and some things as fantasy. And I'm telling you right here and now that that kind of reasoning has deceived humanity to the extent that none of us, and make no mistake, I mean none of us can ever trust our individual nor our collective definitions of reality. Anyway, remember last year around this time when Glenn Hullins was killed out by Lake Hargrove? Had his goddamn throat torn out, stomach and chest ripped open. Messy business all the way around. Messy. Story even made in some of them big city newspapers, Miami, Atlanta, New Orleans. After the cleanup, cops came up with no leads, no suspects, no nothing. Dumbass deputy dog police. They didn't even take notice of the moon phases. Hey, I almost forgot. What about Renee Hughes, Betty Lang, and Christina Perez? Back in June, they, or what was left of them, was found at a campsite up in the mountains. It was a damn shame. 2 of the girls were missing their heads, which, by the way, were never found.
The Perez girl was, let's just say that for the county medical examiner, her body was a lot more difficult to deal with than the other two. Okay, let's review. 4 deaths, 2 full moons. I tell you, some people just don't get it. Eventually, the state and federal boys got involved. Now, if you've ever wanted to see a bunch of rednecks tripping over each other and screwing up an investigation, this would have been the show for you. It was an all-timer. They brought out the horses and dogs, the choppers, and the sworn-in on-the-spot local hick deputies that are always part of situations like that. Anyhow, it didn't matter about all that when you stop and consider that none of those damn Einsteins knew what they were looking for. It never even entered their minds that all the deaths might be the work of a lycanthrope. Anyway, I, of course, knew exactly what was going on. Like I said before, I study this kind of stuff. I clipped all the stories in the papers and, get this, I even taped the reports off the TV and radio. The killings continued. In August, Willie Stelliford, 44-year-old guy of Farm Creek, Alabama, was found disemboweled in the middle of his own cotton field. Then in September, Nelson Weaver, 28, of Fremont, Georgia, was wheeling his way down Route 39 on his Harley. It was late and he was trying to make up some time that he lost when his bike had shut off on him in Regent Circle. All the damn thing needed was a new spark plug. A $2 spark plug. That's how much his life ended up costing. As he came onto the Wilmington Bridge, he saw the thing dart out in the middle of the road. He tried to stop or at least slow down and turn around, but only succeeded in skidding out of control. From that point on, the matter was purely academic. The animal thing bit savagely into his arm, and Nelson felt his world sink into a fiery sea of searing pain and blood. Luckily, he bled to death. You know, of course, that Nelson lived, he would eventually have become just like his attacker. See? I know all about this stuff. Anyway, the police are still looking. They'll probably never come up with anything, and we'll have to close the investigation until the next death. And there will be a next one. They could come and ask me for help, but they probably won't, because police already know everything there is to know about everything, right? Well, it's getting kind of late, and I've got to get out of here. Got to have some time to myself. Can't sit here chatting with you all night. Got a little bit of a headache. I get them from time to time, you know. Need to get some fresh night air. Besides, I'm hungry. And tonight, there's a full moon. Welcome, my friends. It has often been said that madness comes in many forms. but then so too does the devil himself. Witness, therefore, a tale of twisted malignancy set in Boston in the first half of the 19th century. Our story is called Dead Ringer, and it is part and parcel of what you've come to expect on the Nightfall radio show. I stood nearby, but obscurely, away from the crowd, hidden from them by their own absorption into remorse as the priest made his final remarks over the small coffin. It was a beautiful piece of art, made of steel with a beautiful powder blue brush finish, adorned with gold-plated ornaments on the corners and every curve of its shape. Around the edges and equally spaced were small, intricately detailed mermaid ornaments around the entire body of the coffin. It would have appeared that the wee lass was a fan of mermaids. Interestingly enough, mermaids were not the kind, loving creature children's fairy tale authors would have one believe. In fact, they were just the opposite. Aquatic beasts who would lure seamen toward rocks and sandbars in an effort to shipwreck them. In fact, Yes, I'm sorry. I do tend to get off track a bit. On top of the small decorative box was a splash of roses, bright yellow and swimming in a pool of baby breath. Close, a man stood in his long black coat, holding a woman who shared the same black in her attire. Her face, though covered with a veil, carried a sad countenance, and the soft sounds of weeping could be heard escaping her lips from behind the dark curtain hanging from her hat. Between those weeping sounds, short, shallow gasps as her upper body went through the spasms of her pain-driven crying. The man's fedora was pulled low and had drops dripping from the brim as the rain from the sky cut through the air and pelted on him. It was difficult to tell whether it was rain or tears that caused the cheeks to shine beneath the dark circles of his eyes as he held the woman tightly beneath his arm and his hand gently but firmly giving a comforting squeeze to her arm. I looked away from the couple, respectfully taking my curious gaze from them and down. I noticed the same drops that were clinging from the brim of his hat were also beating up on my freshly polished wingtips. The water could not seep through that fresh coat of kiwi boot polish I had just worked into them earlier that morning. I took pride in the appearance of my shoes. It tells a lot about a man, you know? Anyway, I looked back on the scene for moments that seemed like hours and watched the family and friends as they greeted the couple with condolences and the crowd slowly diminished. Eventually, the man pulled the woman away from the site and walked her back to the awaiting coach. They disappeared into the back seat, and the steeds pulled it away through the narrow, snaking path through the cemetery. It is always the saddest moment, you know, riding away from this resting place, leaving the remnant of a loved one that shall never grace your presence again. It reminds me of another time. I'm sorry? Yes, I'm getting to that. You see, that is when it began, this ringing. I completed my task of lowering the tiny coffin into the grave and completely filled in the grave with fresh soil that had been taken from that hole just hours before. The sod was carefully placed back onto the loose soil, and there was no need to water considering the rain that had fallen on the pieces of grass as they waited their resting home. I stood and looked at the grave for a moment and marveled at how beautiful it had been put back together. The headstone of little Angela was a fine piece of craftsmanship and deserved to be complimented by an equally impressive manicured grave. You know that the marble from that particular headstone was of the finest and was imported from... Yes, I do apologize. So it was shortly after that. I was repairing the gravesite of this precious angel when the ringing began. I would say that it was the very next day. I put so much work into this grave, and it pained me so that it was in such a state in just 2 days. The grass sod was disheveled a bit, and the earth was soft, as if it had been moved. Erosion after heavy rains is always a risk in these places, because of such heavy foot traffic on a daily basis. Yes, I'm sorry. The ringing. It was, well, I found it odd. It had been many years since I had heard a ringing like that in my ears. It was, in fact, the very sound, the ringing, that the voices gave way to. What's that? Voices? Absolutely. From as far back as I can remember, I could hear the voices, sometimes so faint that I could not make them out, little more than whispers. Statements, explanations, rhetorical questions filled my head. You ask me if they scared me? No. I was never in a state of terror from these voices. They were sometimes soothing at times when I was facing some of the situations in my home that I'd really prefer not to delve into at this time. It is fairly common knowledge anyway that my father was a savage man, and his cruel and brutal actions eventually led to the death of a man whom he bludgeoned with his own hands. I remember thinking, at least that fellow's beatings are over at the time. But that's another story. You ask me if I ever spoke back to the voices? Good Lord, no. At least not at first. In fact, I tried to ignore them as they became increasingly disturbing to me in the things they pointed out and the things they were encouraging. What? Oh yes, forgive me. Back to the ringing. It began as a faint psee in my ears. So much that I thought, how in the world am I hearing a dog whistle, and looked around me to make sure there were no hounds frantically searching for their master. It had been many years since I heard the voices, which eventually died down to just a little more than a ring, similar to this one. It did go away, so I continued with my work. I take a great deal of pride in the grave sites, you know. It is very important for the families of those who have passed to find the resting place of their loved ones clean and well manicured. There can be many problems encountered in maintaining the estate grounds, from improper fertilization, erosion, as I mentioned, bare spots, dense weeds, but all have to do with neglect, which oh yes, I'm sorry. Where was I? Oh yes. So I continued to work, and I was kneeling down over the little angel site when the ringing started to transform. Suddenly it went from the steady psee to more of a ding ding ding. Well, I knew immediately what it was. As in the cemetery, there were no dinner bells, so it most certainly had to be one of the security bells on a buried coffin. I stopped picking the weeds momentarily and sat perfectly still, and the ringing stopped. I looked around the grounds, and no more than a stone's throw away, there was a gathering of 4 or 5 people visiting a headstone, placing flowers. Did you know that ancient Rome began placing flowers on the grave sites to give comfort to the spirits who they believed circled around the graves? And before that, it dates back as far as... Yes, I do apologize. So I looked to the gathering of people and noticed that they were not fazed at all by the ringing. They were all focused on the headstone. The women were placing kerchiefs to their noses, and the men were hanging their heads, pretending to have sorrow to comfort them. Looking back to the grave, I had repaired it back to its original state. I stood, wiping my hands, and picked the tamp from its resting place on the headstone. To properly take care of sod on these sites, you would really ideally need a sod roller. But with such confined space throughout the property, I find it easier to use the tamp. I began tamping the sod back firmly into the soil when I heard it again. I stopped, looked around. It was louder this time, certainly loud enough for the nearby visitors to hear. I looked towards them, and they were oblivious to the sound. I called towards them. "Excuse me," I yelled. I had to yell it twice, and finally one man turned to see me, and then the others peered over to me. "Sir, do you hear that?" I know that he at least heard me, but he looked at his friends, and they were whispering and shaking their heads. He turned back to me and unsurely shook his head back at me with a slight shrug of his shoulders. The 2 women stood behind the men, as if I was threatening to them. "Sir," I said, "I hate to bother you, but do any of you hear that?" "Hear what?" he asked, frowning, as if he were confused. "That!" I pointed to the air as if to catch one of the sound waves. "That ringing. Do you hear that?" The young man looked at the others, who looked at him in slight confusion and shook their head. He looked at me and shook his head. No, sir, we don't hear anything." "That's absurd," I said more firmly now. I began to say something else when I realized that the ringing had stopped. I looked at the two couples who were staring at me, and I looked around, back at little Angel's grave. I strained my eyes, as if that would sharpen my hearing. Nothing. The ringing had stopped. I looked back at the two couples. The man who had spoken was looking at me with his head cocked to one side. "Sir," he said, "are you okay?" Yes, of course," I replied. "I suppose I've been working way too many hours this week," I replied and chuckled to relieve them of their concern. My day was over, and it was time for me to go home. Margaret would expect me. She knew my schedule, and it was like clockwork. After I placed my tools back in the shed, I locked up and began walking towards the gates that opened to Broad Street. I live just a block away on, well, you know where I live, of course. Yes, of course, the story. I do apologize. As I said, I left for home that afternoon and really thought nothing more about the ringing. Time? I believe it was around 6 p.m. or shortly after. I know that it was late because I recalled it odd that Margaret was not home when I arrived. This was particularly frustrating for me because she always has my dinner cooked, and this was not the case on this day. I pulled out some leftovers, and after adequately stuffing myself from the pork loin from the previous night, I laid on the sofa and fell asleep. No, sir. That was it. I slept through the night and actually woke up a little late. I had to rush to prepare for work and actually didn't even have time to shave properly, nor did I have time to shine my shoes. It is very important the shoes carry that gleam. You know, you can tell a lot about a man by how he keeps his shoes. I've actually seen men in the past that... Yes, I'm sorry. So, I go on to work and to the maintenance office where I pick up the schedule for the day. There was a burial schedule for later that afternoon in the F section, so I had time to work the grounds before getting that site prepared. And that was my routine typically. You know, the groundskeeping is very important. I take a great deal of pride in the grave sites, you know. It is very important for the families of those who have passed to find... Yes, perhaps I have said that. Well, I began my rounds, walking through the grounds and making sure they were clean of debris and trash. I typically will stop if I see weeds growing in the grass of the sites. I'm very meticulous in taking special care. Dense weeds are just one problem one can encounter with ground maintenance. Improper fertilization, erosion, and basically just neglect can lead... Yes, I'm sorry. Sometimes my mind wanders. So I was working the ground of Gladys Morris, 1795 to 1825. If you ask me, far too young to die. I remember her service and how sad it was that there was but one soul there, her husband, and he... I'm sorry. So I was working the grounds of Gladys when I heard the faint ringing again. I rose from my knees and glanced around in an effort to assess where the ringing was coming from. But I already knew. I walked towards the gravesite of little Angela and realized that it was, in fact, coming from there. Now, as you know, the security bells are there for a purpose, but I'm quite sure from the type of trauma this little girl suffered, there was no chance that she had been erroneously pronounced dead and buried alive. I looked around for someone, anyone, that could possibly confirm what I was hearing. I saw John walking towards the section and yelled for him. I'm sorry? Yes, John is one of our custodial staff. A rather large black man, but nice chap. Unfortunately not very well educated, nor articulate. Rather strong fellow, though. I once saw him alone take the end of a... Yes, of course. So John recognized that I was hailing him and walked to the gravesite of Angela. I looked at him inquisitively as he stared back at me. What do you make of that, John? I asked him. Make of what, sir? He responded. That ringing, John. Certainly he could hear the ringing. What ringing, Mr. K? John called me Mr. K, or Mr. K, as his dialect was, mostly because my last name is so unique to some. I can actually remember when I was a young lad in grade school, the teacher... Yes, sir. I apologize. So I asked John if he could not hear that ringing. No, sir. He shook his head. I don't hear no ringing. I know that he could see I was shocked, and I looked to Angela's grave and held my hand out to the grave and looked back to him. He looked at me with a perplexed look. He looked to the grave and back to me again and shook his head. Mr. K, you all right? John was such a gentle man, a gentle giant. At any rate, I told John, yes, I was fine, and to run along and apologize for interfering with his duties. But the ringing, oh my heavens. It just continued over and over. I looked around to see if there was anyone else, and there was not a soul in sight. But the ringing persisted. I knelt down onto little Angela's resting place and put my ear close to the grass. It was definitely coming from her coffin, and I was horrified. Could it be? Could the physician have made such a grave error in pronouncing this little angel dead? Was she ringing the security bell with her tiny hands? I stood and decided something must be done about this. I went to the maintenance office, which is a good 75 yards away from lot 467, which is the site of little Angela. I was in a rush to find someone, but was careful not to trample the grass of the clients. There's enough walk traffic through the property without me adding more damage to some of the sites. You know, combined with erosion and improper fertilization due to budgets, we must take special care to ensure these. Yes, again, I apologize. So I arrived at the maintenance office of Mr. Hardy. He's the shift supervisor. He was in a conference with 2 vendors. We get vendors quite frequently who ask for referrals for their custom headstones, flowers, and a multitude of, yes, okay. So as I burst into the room, Mr. Hardy and the 2 guests appeared startled. I suppose I did come rather abruptly. I began to tell him the situation, but Mr. Hardy held his finger up to me and gave me a condescending look to silence me. I stepped back and waited on him to finish his conversation with the 2 salesmen. As the 2 vendors left the office and closed the door behind them, I stepped forward to speak, but Mr. Hardy raised his finger at me again. "Corindak," he said as his eyes looked me up and down, "have you looked at yourself in the mirror today?" Well, I'm sure I did not know where this was headed. As I stated, I was running late this particular morning and surely did not look at myself in the mirror. "Sir?" I asked. "Look at you," he said. "You haven't shaved and are looking quite unkempt there. Your clothes look like you slept in them." As he looked at my feet and back to my face, "And your shoes, man. It looks like you've scuffed them up with fudge." He shook his head. "Don't you have a burial at 3 today?" "Yes," I told him. "Yes, I do, but sir, there is a bell ringing from lot 467. He looked at me with a confused look. 467? Who? "I don't know that lot." He looked at his ledger and flipped through the pages. I watched as he drug his fat, stubby index finger down the column to find the information. He found it and without lifting his head looked at me over the rim of his glasses, which were resting on the end of his nose. He looked up and removed his glasses. "Corindak, you do know what happened to that little girl. There is absolutely no way this was an error. The family was unable to even do an open coffin ceremony. They weren't even able to do post-mortem photographs." Yes, I know. But nonetheless, sir, there is a ringing coming from that lot." He stared at me for a moment, looking me down with his eyes again to my feet and back up to my eyes. "Okay," he said, grabbing his hat from the rack hanging beside his desk. "I'm going to come out there with you so we can settle this. And then you're going to get yourself straightened up and cleaned up for that service this afternoon. We can't have our clients' families seeing our staff looking like vagabonds at their services." So together we walked across the property, carefully navigating the resting sites of the beloved. I'm always careful to stay off of the grass, as it's hard to keep up. We have a great deal of foot traffic through this property, and combined with the erosion and, oh yes, you're right, I do drift. So we walked the 75 yards, and as we near the grave site, it comes again, the ringing. I looked to Mr. Hardy with a hesitant and slight grin. He returned a smirk to me with his fat jowls, causing my grin to disappear. We got to the site of little Angela, and the ringing was loud, over and over again. I looked at Mr. Hardy, waiting on him to respond. He just stared at me. I looked at him as his thick neck spilled over his collar. He had the nerve to say something about my appearance as he stood there with his shirt barely able to stay tucked in his over-barrel belly and a mustard stain on the front of his tie. And I'm unsure if the stain was even from today. It could have been, yes, sorry. "Well," he said, shrugging his shoulders, "I'm here." The ringing was fading a little, but it was still audible, over and over. "Do you not hear that?" I said. "Here, I said, kneeling down on the grass, which was still soft from the repair I had done the previous day, but was looking a lot better. Here, do you not hear it? Kerendek. He looked at me with his hands on his hips as his belly lapped over his belt. I don't hear anything. There is no bell. That little girl is dead. D-E-A-D. You got it? Now, you got half an hour before the service, so you need to get your ass cleaned up and shaven, or you will find yourself without a job come tomorrow. You got it? He turned and walked away. I thought to myself, that fat fuck. I was so angry as I watched him waddle away, trampling on the nearby resting sites, that I didn't even realize that the ringing had stopped. I was actually more concerned with him damaging the grass of the patrons. At any rate, the ringing had stopped, and I lifted myself up and wiped off the leg of my trousers. I went back to my locker and was able to find a razor and did a dry shave in the bathroom. There was little I could do about the condition of my clothes other than just straighten them out by hand. I did take some paper towels and wipe my shoes off the dirt. I really found it odd that there was so much dirt on my shoes and actually caked around my soles. I'd been repairing some of the grave sites, but I didn't think I'd been in that much soil. I wiped the shoes clean, and though I didn't have my kiwi polish with me, I was able to get them at least to acceptable cleanliness, though not the normal shine that I have. I worked the service at 3, and as the family was carried away in the coach and the sounds of the horse hoofs were out of earshot, I began closing this grave. By the time I put up my tools in the maintenance shed, it was past quitting time, and as I began my walk towards the gates on Broad Street, I could see the light on in the maintenance office, realizing that Mr. Hardy was putting in a late night. What? No, sir, I did not stop to speak. In fact, I didn't go anywhere near the office. I made my way to the gates and to my home. I live just a block away, and I'm sure that Margaret would be waiting for me. I would not share with her the encounter with Mr. Hardy, as sometimes she seemed to defend him over me in my grievances with my supervisor. If I didn't know better, I would have sworn that they may have had some kind of inappropriate activity between them. But that was neither here nor there with this story. I arrived home a little after 6 p.m. Again, Margaret was not yet home, and I suspected she'd been visiting her mother on the east side. The truth of the matter is, we've been quarreling for a while, but lately it'd become worse. You see, we had a daughter several years ago that got the fever and passed away. Little Maggie was just 4 years old. I suspected that she was becoming ill because she'd been acting a little under the weather and not her normal self. I had asked Margaret to have Dr. Giles, he's our physician, come by and see her. I thought she'd done it. Maggie began to develop a rash over her little face, and within days the fever was so high that she felt like a broiler to the touch. Dr. Giles came by and gave us a grim report, and within days little Maggie had left to be with the Lord. It was only days after that I found that Margaret had not reached out to Dr. Giles to come see Maggie. She felt distraught over it, blaming herself. I tried to console her and tell her that the Lord would probably forgive her for her neglect, but nevertheless it was difficult to overcome. Since that time, our relationship has not quite been the same. She seems to run to her mother, who manages to pet her and make her feel comfortable, and I no longer fight her desire to be absent. But I digress. When I got to the gates, there were a few people passing on Broad. I stopped the first couple I saw, pleading with them. They backed away from me like I was a madman or something. I actually think they looked afraid. That was totally absurd. I pleaded my case with them. What? No, of course not. I didn't touch them. The man put his arm around the woman and they backed away as if they were in danger or something. As they moved along quickly, I turned looking for someone, anyone, who could help me. Another gentleman coming walking towards me noticed me immediately and went to navigate around me, but I stopped him. I started to tell him the story about the ringing, over and over. He looked at me as the other couple did, like I was a madman. He turned to walk away, but I grabbed his coat sleeve and pleaded. He told me to get my filthy, stinking hands off of him and snatched away, brushing his coat off as he walked away. Sir? No. I would say that I approached 3 more people, all with the same results. The ringing was louder and even more intense. I could hear it from the gates. I kept pleading with passersby, "Don't you hear that? Please help. She is alive." But no one would listen. They all just stared at me like a freak. They looked at me with the same look that adulterous pig had looked at me with the day before. And the ringing would not stop. Over and over. I could no longer stand it. I surrendered my efforts to solicit help from the street and ran back into the cemetery. I ran through the lots as the crow flies and bumped my knee on a headstone. I looked, and sure enough, I had torn a hole in the leg of my trousers. From what? Why, yes, I did. I know I don't normally cross grave sites, but this was urgent. I had no choice, and I knew I could repair the sites tomorrow. The closer I got to little Angela's grave, the louder it got, that maddening ringing in my ears, over and over. I pounced down onto the grave and began tearing the loose grass away. I could tell this site had been tampered with, as the grass was not even rooting into the soil. My tools were close, but I could not stop to get them. I had to get this site open. I continued to dig. The moist and loose soil began to stick beneath my fingernails, staining them like dried blood. It was odd to me that the soil was too soft, seeing that this particular grave was several days old now, and we had not had rain since the first night. I heard my name being called and was startled when John's hand grabbed my shoulder. "Mr. K," he said, "Mr. K, what are you doing?" And he tried to pull me, lightly. John is such a gentle man, you know, but my arm, I pulled away and regret that I lashed out at him, knocking him backwards. Yes, I did intentionally push him away. At any rate, he didn't bother me again. And the ringing, that terrible ringing, continued in my head, over and over. I had dug as much as I could with my hands and reached over the ground and grabbed my short shovel. I looked at him. John was laying on the ground and found it odd that he wasn't moving. I continued to work with the shovel this time. I was a good 4 feet into the hole when I heard your officers yelling at me. They kept yelling at me, Sir, you need to stop and come out of the hole." I looked at them as I continued to dig the loose dirt away. "Can't you hear that?" I screamed at them. "Sir, you need to stop now," they commanded, but I ignored them and continued to dig. One of the lads jumped into the hole with me and grabbed my arm. I pulled away and turned to face him. He had his club pulled out, ready to hit me. I couldn't believe I was being assaulted by an officer. I pleaded with him to step away, but he would not. He persisted that I stop and get out of the hole. He reached to grab my arm again, and I had no choice. I hit him across the face with my shovel. He immediately dropped to the ground. I moved him away and began digging again. His partner began blowing that whistle loudly, yelling for help. Now I had to deal with the ringing of that damn bell and that bloody whistle. Within moments, I began to hit something, and it was not a coffin. In fact, I was a little more than 4.5 feet into this grave, and the coffin was a good 6 feet down. I pushed the shovel into whatever this object was, and it felt somewhat squishy and soft. I tossed the shovel down and got on my knees and began to hand dig again. I saw his fat, balding head first. It was no wonder I felt it was something squishy. It was that sow of a man, Terrell Hardy, that I was uncovering. He was on his side and appeared to be dressed in the same clothes that he was in the previous day. In fact, I'm sure of it because the slob still had the tie with the mustard stain on it. I had to brush off the dirt to make sure. He was laying a little odd, and I noticed a hand on his chest that certainly could not have been his. So I began digging some more. I uncovered the dirt and began tossing it back into the officer, who was still unconscious from... Yes. So I continued uncovering the body belonging to this mysterious hand, and I recognized it at once. It was the locket that I had given her on our first anniversary, and inside it a photo of her and of little Maggie. At one time, I had held that place where her photo was, but she had replaced my face with her own. It was Margaret, and it was no wonder that I had not seen her for 2 days. It was about that time that you and your other partners had arrived. I looked up out of the hole and realized the ringing had stopped. The sound of the bell was gone. Something told me that there was something wrong here, that there was something that needed to be uncovered. Poor Margaret, never able to forgive herself for the death of little Maggie, turning to this fat lard of a man for comfort instead of me. I can't say that I have any animosity towards whomever committed this absolute heinous crime.
but I'm certainly glad that you fellows were there to see this discovered. And even more so, I'm glad that that terrible ringing over and over again inside my head is now gone.